and good evening for those joining us online. So our Accountability, Reconciliation and Transitional Justice in Sri Lanka event. I would like to first thank the Human Rights Program, the Program on Law and Society involved at Harvard Law School, and the Harvard Law School Advocates for Human Rights for co-sponsoring this event. I would like to thank and welcome our two panelists, who are Thyagi Ruwanpathirana, who is the Neil Individual Memorial Fellow at the Human Rights Program and the Law and Society Administration. Thyagi is Amnesty International's South Asia Regional Office. It works at the Amnesty International's South Asia Regional Office in Colombo. And she was the National Legal Advisor for Sri Lanka for the International Commission of Jurists in the past. And Thyagi is currently, as a fellow, studying transitional justice in Sri Lanka, researching. Kate Cronin-Furman, Dr. Kate Cronin-Furman is the Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University College of London, where she directs the MA program in human rights. Kate is a lawyer with legal practice experience, as well as a political science scholar who studies mass atrocities and has published extensively on transitional justice, as well as transitional justice in Sri Lanka. Please, let's welcome panelists and
Thanks, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our online audience as well. We thought, because there are only two of us on the panel today, that we would run this a little unconventionally and do it as a conversation rather than kind of formal panel remarks. And hopefully that will also encourage you guys to bring up any questions that you have as well. So I'm going to start with my question for you, which is, given that we may have sort of varying levels of knowledge of the case in the room, transitional justice for what? What are we talking about when we talk about transitional justice in Sri Lanka?
Right, so I don't know how many of you are aware of what's happened in Sri Lanka and why we thought about transitional justice in the first place. So I'll start with like a very brief history, just for those of you who don't know. There was an internal armed conflict from 1983, which ended brutally in 2009. There were two main factions. Obviously, the government that was fighting the separatist guerrilla group, which is called the LTTE, which is, say, the biggest sort of Tamil paramilitary group that's been there. There have been others as well. And, you know, obviously the war went on for like nearly 3 decades. From 83 to 2009, there have been 4 phases, Ilam War 1, 2, 3, and 4. So here we're mostly talking about Ilam War 4, which started after the end of the ceasefire and went into full-blown conflict. And in this period, there were a lot of international law violations, both international human rights law violations, as well as international humanitarian law violations from both sides. And a UN panel of experts group had a report that was released, I believe, around 2012, I want to say, that found credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by both sides, ranging from, I'll give you a few of those key findings, was that from the government forces side, it was killing of civilians through widespread shelling. Then there was shelling of hospitals and humanitarian objects. There was denial of humanitarian assistance. There was human rights violations that were suffered by victims and survivors of the conflict, including both IDPs and suspected LTT cadre. There was also human rights violations outside the conflict. And then from the LTT side, there were 6 credible types of violations that were found. To be credible, there was using civilians as a human buffer, killing civilians who attempted to flee or to take control, using military equipment in proximity of civilians, forced recruitment of children, forced labor, and suicide, targeting civilians outside the conflict zone as well. So those are kind of like the main violations we speak about, violations and abuses, and it's for those atrocity crimes that victims have been demanding justice for a very long time now, because this year marks 15 years since the end of the internal conflict.
So I think, depending on our philosophical persuasion and view of the world, we may or may not find it shocking that it's been 15 years since very serious mass atrocities, and we've seen absolutely no accountability for these crimes. Obviously, we've seen similar crimes committed elsewhere, and a great deal of variation in whether they receive justice or not. Sri Lanka is a case in which the victim community has been incredibly vocal and well organized around advocating for recognition of the crimes committed against them and accountability for those crimes. But despite that fact and the very serious effort that victims have put into it, as have allies both domestically and internationally, there's been very little progress. Could you tell us a little bit about what the sort of current state of play domestically on the question of transitional justice is?
So if we think about sort of when we talk about transitional justice, Sri Lanka, it's hard to really pinpoint when that transition moment was, because even though the war ended in 2009, the government, the regime that ended the war was still in power up until 2015. And this was a government that was elected back in 2005. So for a good decade, it was the same regime in power. So we wouldn't really assign the word transition to the period that they were still in power. So if there are some piecemeal efforts, sometimes tokenistic, certainly so looking back now, that transitional moment may have been available to the victims in civil society, I would say in 2015. And that was when and that also takes me back to the fact that why we're talking about the role of the international community here with regards to Sri Lanka is because the reason and the way the transitional justice discourse even started in Sri Lanka was due to international pressure. And that's why in 2015, and I think this may have been the first time in the world that a country that was the concern or subject of Human Rights Council resolution was willing to co-sponsor a resolution, and then the government of the day came up with a transitional justice package. So they said they would set up credible domestic institutions, and the package included a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an Office on Missing Persons, an Office on Reparations, and a special judicial mechanism that was designed, or at least in theory supposed to be a hybrid court essentially, because there was a recognition that the domestic institutions were unwilling and unable to provide justice for the war crimes against humanity and the human rights violations that occurred. So since then, we've had several sort of changes in government. So 2015 to 2019, there was one government in power. They were the ones who proposed this TJ package. And then there was also, in 2019, there was again a regime change that meant that the same government that was credited with ending the war was back in power. So it was sort of like there was a brief 4-year transition moment, and then there was a reversal. And at the moment, how it is that these domestic institutions are there in sort of like a, I would say, it's a show almost. They're hollow institutions. They're staffed with people who don't really have the will to carry on investigations and redress victims' needs. So that's how it is. So because of this, parallelly, we've had to rely on, as human rights activists in civil society, we've also had to rely on international pressure to make sure that these crimes, which are so egregious, which shocks the conscience of humanity, so that needs to be redressed internationally if domestically nothing is going on. And this is really why the sort of conversation and Human Rights Council has been so important to Sri Lanka. And so there have been resolutions on Sri Lanka, I would say, since 2012, non-stop. So it's been about 14 years of resolutions where partly the government is given the chance to work on domestic institutions which are credible. But to date, we've not really seen a lot of action come out of that. But at the same time, because that's not forthcoming, we now have to rely on the Human Rights Council process to set up institutions themselves. So what the victims have been asking for, so many of you may not know, Sri Lanka actually has the second largest number of enforced experiences caseload in the world before the UN Working Group on Enforced Experiences, next only to Iraq. And so the disappearances issue is a big one. To date, there are families that are missing who are protesting, who are demanding answers, who are looking for justice, so on and so forth. So that lobby has been something that you can't really forget about it. I know the southern politicians, Sinhalese politicians would really like to look at this as a thing of the past, but it's very much a real thing. It's an ongoing wound, and it's what the ICRC calls an ambiguous loss, right? So because of that, what the families have wanted is essentially an international court. An ad hoc court that would look into these cases, that would hold to account the perpetrators. And so, that's what's been asked. But what the Human Rights Council process managed to achieve 2 years ago was something in between, something a little less than that, which is a body we call the Sri Lanka Accountability Project. It's not a IIIM kind of situation, it's not a court by itself, but it's a process where the council has mandated the UNHCR to have a group of people who would be gathering evidence for future prosecutions. So that is ongoing. There's still, we just had another resolution passed in September, but the mandate was extended for only 1 year because there's also political change back home. We had elections just late today. So that's kind of where we're at. So I think our logic has been that, sure, I can understand that a lot of foreign governments want to give each Sri Lankan government, consecutive ones, keep coming up to power promising, yes, give us a chance, we'll set up credible domestic institutions, but then by the end of that tenure, families are not got anything out of it. So because of that, keeping international pressure and making sure that international justice has been so key for the families who disappeared and the victims of Sri Lanka. I think I'll turn the mic over to you now and ask you a few questions as well. So domestically, we touched on this already. These have not got addressed for a very long time, right? And so what options are there? Like I know we're talking about transition, just ideally it's domestic institutions that would do the legwork, has to have the political will, because that's the ideal situation. But what do we do when that's not there?
Yeah, so, when we talk about transitional justice, formally we're looking for a couple of things, right? We're looking for criminal accountability of the individuals who are most responsible for the most serious crimes and, then kind of as far down the line as we can get, right? We're looking for truth, right? Victims, these are Tamil mothers and grandmothers that disappeared here. They want to know what's happened to their loved ones. We're looking for reparations, right? Where harms can be quantified and people can be given some degree of redress for what they suffered. And we're also looking for guarantees of non-recurrence, right? So we want change to existing structures that enable abuses to occur. In cases where there is limited domestic political will or political interest in excavating the past and assigning accountability and responsibility for it, yes. It is very hard to get kind of robust transitional justice along any of these dimensions, right? It's particularly hard to get criminal accountability, right? Because that is the most kind of core implication of the state's sovereignty. It involves kind of making legal judgments about the conduct of a war that states consider to be kind of vital to their national security interests, et cetera. It potentially threatens regime stability, right? People in power implicated. So, as you said, we think about transitional justice as really only being good and robust in cases where domestic political will is there and domestic institutions are created with buy-in from the voting public to do this work. Sri Lanka is a context in which that is not available. We have a majority of the electorate that for a long time didn't believe crimes were committed at all. I'm going to kick back to you in a few minutes to ask where public sentiment stands currently. But there's very little interest outside of the victim community in pursuing transitional justice for these crimes. And what that means is that we are kind of left with a menu of second best options, right? We have a robust international legal architecture that says it is not just the business of the territorial state. What happens to their citizens is in fact the business of the entire international community, that international actors, foreign governments, et cetera, are able to look inside the black box of the state in order to pursue human rights, to pursue redress for violations, et cetera. But obviously, we have an imperfect system for doing that, and it is in many senses dependent on cooperation from the territorial state. So in this case, many victims have long asked for trials at the International Criminal Court, for instance, to prosecute military and civilian leaders for their conduct of the final days of the war. Sri Lanka has not signed on to the Rome Statute, right? The International Criminal Court is a consent-based organization that Sri Lanka has not consented to the jurisdiction of. Which means that the only way that these crimes would get to that court is through intervention of the UN Security Council and a referral. We are sadly or happily, depending on your perspective, not in a world where the UN Security Council is going to refer this case, right? Sri Lanka has the strong support of China, which would veto. Russia would almost certainly also veto. It's honestly a little bit up in the air whether the US would consent to that as well. So that knocks out one of the international community's sort of primary backstops to inaction at the domestic level. Another option that's sort of come up repeatedly in this case, and you mentioned in the discussion of the 2015 package of measures, the possibility of a hybrid court, right? So in a number of post-conflict contexts, there have been what are called hybrid tribunals. These are tribunals that are formally set up within the domestic justice system with international cooperation, right? So where, for instance, a domestic judiciary, domestic kind of legal community lacks expertise in international crimes, there have been sort of international jurists, international judges, international lawyers participating in the work of those courts. This is also not super viable at the moment because it does require the domestic judicial system to be heavily engaged in prosecuting atrocity crimes. So we are quite limited in what the international community can do so far as ensuring prosecution of those most responsible for atrocities in Sri Lanka. So what we have seen, as you said, is, for instance, the creation of the SLAP, that's the body tasked with collecting and preserving evidence against the possibility of a future world in which, one or more of these options are no longer foreclosed. And we have seen, significant pressure from international actors on the Sri Lankan government, right, to get them to sort of move their position on prosecution, but also focusing in on questions of truth, questions of reparation. There's less work on the guarantees of non-recurrence than I'd expected, actually. So as you said, we've seen heavy engagement from the UN Human Rights Council since 2012. That has taken the form of resolutions that were largely kind of pushed forward by global north governments, Europe, US, Canada, with some kind of engagement from Latin America as well, which have sort of repeatedly asked Sri Lanka to commit to doing more, to make real changes at the domestic level. As you said, in 2015, we saw what might have been kind of a brief window for a little bit of a redirect, where the new government co-sponsored a resolution committing to these 4 different institutional types. But I think, unfortunately, what we've seen again and again with regard to Sri Lanka is that push and pull between government's desire to maintain a good reputation on the international stage, right? So that was kind of a key transition when the 2015 government came into power, right? Is that the government that had won the war and stayed in power for 6 years afterwards was pretty comfortable with an antagonistic relationship with the West, right, and with the UN. That was valuable to them in terms of their domestic political constituency. They were happy to be seen pushing back against Western human rights pressure. In 2015, we get a government that comes in and wants to have a different kind of relationship, wants to have different economic relations with the West, but also is more interested in being seen as a member in good standing of the international legal order. So we saw the sort of push and pull between that impulse to kind of improve those relationships and the fact that their domestic political constituency really wasn't that interested in transitional justice and that it would potentially be harmful to them to pursue it. So I think, it was in many ways predictable that we didn't see them kind of meet those commitments that they made. That doesn't mean that international pressure can't move the needle, right? So, and this is something that is common across cases where domestic political will isn't there, right? International pressure has a big ask, and that ask is always for, prosecution, punishment of those most responsible. We're very unlikely to get that when domestic political will isn't there, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't still have value at the domestic level. It has value because it tells victims that they're not alone, right? That the harms they've suffered are recognized. It has value because it potentially empowers domestic activists like yourself, right? In order to, so that you're not just out there in the wilderness alone making these demands. But, it is always a long-term, iterative engagement. It's always one that doesn't produce the action it asks for, right? But it is something that kind of, we have to kind of keep coming back to. Yeah, exactly. I think chipping away is exactly right. I'll maybe pause there since I just said a lot of things.
I do have a follow-up.
Yeah.
Just for the audience's sort of knowledge, out of the kind of domestic transitional justice package that was offered in 2015, up till now there's been 2 that's been set up. The Truth Commission and the Office on Missing Persons were established. The hybrid court and the Truth Commission are lagging behind. The previous government did talk about, again, passing a law that would set up a new Truth Commission. Sri Lanka's had a whole host, a litany of commissions of inquiry in the past. So it's nothing new. People, I mean, victims we speak to say we've been to 13 commissions already. Do you expect us to go to a 14?
When I met with these families of the disappeared in 2016 and 2017, I asked everybody, how many times have you presented your evidence? And they were like, oh God, so many. And I was like 20, and they're like, no more. I was like, 50? And several of them were like, no, it's been more than 50 times that I've gone to a domestic institution, an international body, a police office,
The Rights Commission,
yeah,
ICRC,
like it becomes full-time labor for them, right, to keep taking forward their claim.
And yeah, which is why now, we're talking about TRC again, and even under this new government that came into power in September, while, the victims can't afford to wait anymore, right? They've waited for so long. And I think when we're talking about the role of the international community and what options are available, I want to pick your brain about what your idea is about universal jurisdiction, targeted sanctions, work, because in a way for victims, they're really looking for when they say justice, it's really sometimes a sense of fairness. It's not really always the case that they're looking for criminal prosecutions, but they need some sense of justice, some kind of acknowledgement that the atrocity crimes that they were sort of part of is recognized by somebody. And this is why at the Human Rights Council, the UNHCR's reports keep calling for countries to take action, use universal jurisdiction principles, apply them, and try and consider targeted sanctions. I want to see what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think, one of the challenging things here is that victims are not a monolith, right? So, victims within one community, and even the same person from day to day, month to month, year to year, want different things and understand justice to mean different things. So for some people, the most important thing for them will be that the person that killed their family member doesn't get away with it. For others, it'll be that the leadership is subject to some kind of accountability. Other people, just want to know what happened. Other people are much more concerned with, their economic well-being or getting their home back. So these are all really different conceptions of justice. But for every single one of them, the persistence of absolute impunity is an ongoing injury, right? So that is universal amongst the community. When we talk about universal jurisdiction cases, does everyone know what that is? We are at law school, so hopefully yes. For those in the audience at home, universal jurisdiction is something that allows foreign governments to prosecute human rights abuses that occurred on another state's territory, right? And the way they may get jurisdiction over those events could be because victims have come to their country. It could be because one of the perpetrators has taken a trip to their country. There's a couple different ways that this triggers, but essentially what it means is that another country's court conducts a criminal trial for a human rights abuse that occurred in this instance during the war in Sri Lanka. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, right? Because on the one hand, it is something that victims can look to and say, okay, here is a concrete example of somebody actually being prosecuted and hopefully convicted and punished for this. But on the other hand, it's very far removed, right? And we tend to think, when we look at kind of the studies of psychosocial impacts of transitional justice, we tend to think that they have more impact when they are conducted in places where victims can observe trials, within the communities where they happened. So I think, yes, that it is a measure of some accountability. It can be hard for victims to access, and I think in order to sort of maximize the impact, it probably takes significant political work back home of, making sure that victims can see what's happening, can understand the legal theories, which are, can be quite kind of attenuated. So yeah, I think, for me, yes, I think it's absolutely worth pursuing, but I think it has to come with a whole bunch of other work to kind of make it resonate for affected communities. Targeted sanctions is kind of a whole other kettle of fish, is the other expression. Targeted sanctions are basically a punitive measure that governments impose on individuals who are responsible for serious human rights violations. And they tend to include things like asset freezes, travel bans. When the US, since we're sitting in the US classroom, when the US imposes targeted sanctions on someone, it means that usually they can't come to the United States. Their money that is here is taken from them. It is kind of varying the degree to which people experience that as real punishment. I think it is often talked about as something that has deterrent impact, right? So it is something that is activists pursue in cases of active atrocity commission. It's not great for that purpose, right? Because the amount of costs that it imposes on perpetrators is pretty minimal against the benefit that they get from continuing their campaign of atrocities, unfortunately. It maybe is a little bit more impactful in cases where it's levied against kind of post-atrocity perpetrators as a sort of deterrent, a general deterrent, right, against other cases, right? So I think, we saw the targeted sanctions against Sri Silva, right? So Sri Silva was a member of the Sri Lankan military who was heavily implicated in serious violations at the end of the war at the command level. Several years later, no, more than 10 years later, right?
It was just recent. Over the last 5 years.
Yeah, so he was when Gotabaya came in, right? He appointed him as head of the military.
He was the chief of defense staff.
Yeah. Okay, and then the U.S. imposed targeted sanctions because he was, there were very credible allegations against him. It is considered not the done thing in the international community to appoint a war criminal to positions of high command, and so there was lots of activism and advocacy around this from the Tamil community, from other activists, and the U.S. slapped targeted sanctions on him. That did not convince the Sri Lankan government to revoke his appointment.
The then president himself was accused of heinous crimes himself.
Yeah, so the then president had actually been his boss at the time, so was at least as responsible for the allegations in question. Didn't convince them to revoke his appointment, probably didn't really affect his personal day-to-day, but arguably helps us by kind of strengthening the norm against appointing war criminals, right? Because it says to other countries, like, if you appoint someone like this to a position of power, we're not going to let them come to the US. Like, they're going to have their assets frozen, etc. So again, like, the costs that targeted sanctions present are only likely to be impactful against actors who don't have that super imbalanced cost-benefit calculus, right? So I think it's not, unfortunately, a good solve for like dealing with the instant case, right? And providing justice to victims who have suffered. It potentially helps potential future victims, right? But, I think, yes, all of these people probably should be slapped with targeted sanctions just as a sort of moral, what is the right thing to do question. Probably victims would agree with that and say, yes, go for it. But it doesn't necessarily change their behavior or convince the Sri Lankan government to move its position on transitional justice. I think of the two things you mentioned, universal jurisdiction proceedings in other countries probably have a little more oomph, but again, it takes work.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Sri Silva's case, it wasn't just him who was slapped sanctions on, it was also his entire family.
Yes.
Which meant that so none of his kids could basically attend school in the US, for example. And I guess for victims back home, it was some sense that, like, they themselves lost their loved ones, so at least Shamil Silva's kids can't go to a US school, something like that, or the, places where they could freely move about, that regime is now sort of restricted. So yeah, I just wanted to add that as well.
I think there's often this huge painful disparity between the consequences that perpetrators face and what victims have suffered. So, when accused war criminals go to the ICC or the ICTY that was in The Hague, victims are very conscious that those people are there in fairly comfortable conditions. They have access to medication for all their health concerns. They get to take a cooking class. They get to play ping pong with the other war criminals. So even when we do see, justice, it still really feels to victims really just not enough, right, compared to what they've suffered. So not being able to go to school in California,
Or relative.
tough times.
Should we speak a little bit about Aragalaya?
I think for me it's a real question. We saw some sort of moments of solidarity between the majority and minority communities. So 2 years ago, there was a mass public protest movement in Sri Lanka, which you can give us more detail on. But does that shift the needle at all in terms of domestic attitude towards war crimes?
I would say, so what happened was back in 2022, 2 years ago, there was a lot of bad economic decisions that were taken that led to the country essentially going bankrupt. Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy, and because of this, there were power shortages because there was no foreign currency to be able to import fuel. There were medicine shortages. People were lining up for, just similar to the images you would have seen in Lebanon. There were queues for fuel. So just sort of everyday life was so difficult for people, and this brought, I would say for the first time in Sri Lanka, such a large public, which had just 4 years ago elected Gotabaya with landslide victory back in 2019. Just by 2022, there was so much hate and despair amongst people who voted for him that people came back onto the streets and they were like, we want the God, we want the Rajpaksa government, which also happens to be the government that ended the war, credited with it, with horrible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and it was the same government that was there. So it was sort of the kind of work that we've been trying to say, kind of the accountability that we were asking for. It was sadly that the economic mismanagement was ultimately what ousted them from power. So the people who came onto the streets basically demanded that the Rajpaksa government sort of resign, get someone else in. They're basically done with them. So for victims in a way, some kind of justice, but again, not for human rights violations. It was the economic discontent that ultimately brought people to the roads. And so how that ended was also brutal. A lot of crackdown on civic protests and things like that. But that meant that there was now an opportunity, and which is ultimately, 2 years later, that people were given that opportunity in September to electorally change the political leadership. So now a Marxist-leaning party has come into power. Just in September, later today is the parliamentary elections happening, the first time since the Aragalaya protest movement. And we're not sure what the new government strategy will be. They've made some good noises in the past. We've seen over the past few weeks since coming into power, some backpedaling on that as well, including something their campaign promised, which was to get rid of the draconian anti-terror law. It's called the Prevention of Terrorism Act. They have promised to repeal it, but now they're sort of kind of saying let's visit that discussion after the new parliament is in place. We've seen some problematic statements like that as well, some appointments that have been done over the past few weeks that have been problematic as well. But I think the only change is that this is a party that was, not the two traditional parties. For the first time in Sri Lanka, we have a third party who's managed to come into power. And that's solely because of the protest movement that took place in 2022 that went on for several months. You would have seen the images of people jumping into pools. Sadly, that seems to be the image that has stuck in people's minds about what the protests in Sri Lanka look like. And similarly, I think in Bangladesh, sadly, there will be bad pictures that people remember from these sort of moments where huge public uprising has managed to get rid of abusive governments. So it's a moment, but let's see what they do with that sort of, this opportunity they have. It's a good one, but I don't think victims can afford to wait on another government to be genuine in providing truth, justice, and reparations, because victims have waited long enough. So it's sort of like, yes, let's give them a chance, but at the same time, it's not to drop the ball at all on the national justice angle that we need really to be pursuing at the same time and very parallelly through Human Rights Council processes and other processes, universal jurisdiction, targeted sanctions, as much as we can with the ICC referral and things like that as well.
Should we take questions from the room? Sure.
Yeah, we should. Are there any other questions?
There's a question from, sorry, did I say that?
Thanks, this has been really interesting and enlightening. I was wondering if there's any or what the coordination between Global North countries and the victim groups in Sri Lanka looks like, and what those communications are.
Yeah, I think, that's something that is particularly pronounced in this case, actually, because there is a large and active Tamil diaspora with very close links to the affected community on the ground. And because for the first few years after the end of the war, repression in the former war zone was so intense, and surveillance was so prevalent and militarization was so pervasive, a lot of the advocacy on this had to take place by necessity outside of Sri Lanka. Diaspora groups have organized in the US, in Canada, in the UK, France, Germany, have been a very prominent and engaged presence at Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council sessions, really advocating on behalf of the community on the ground, both to pursue justice for the crimes that were committed at the end of the war, but also to improve the conditions in the aftermath of the war. So, for the first couple of years, a huge population was in they were called displacement camps, but they were something quite sinister. So people were basically impounded, people were subject to serious human rights violations and so on. It's been another kind of core organizing point, the PTA, right, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which has been used to detain people without trial for just insanely long periods of time. So this is a case where there's been incredible organization by the victim community, and quite a lot of back and forth between global North human rights organizations and diaspora and homeland advocates and officials in government. We were talking about this before the event. It's a little bit hindered by the fact that embassy staff, international organization staff turn over so frequently. So this is something that is quite frustrating for victim community organizers across a variety of country contexts, right? Which is that you end up every couple of years having to educate a whole new set of people about the situation, and you alluded to this with the fact that we we get a new government in Sri Lanka that says, oh yeah, we're gonna like do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and staff of the embassies on the ground are like, that sounds great. We love Truth and Reconciliation Commissions with like no knowledge of the 15 that went before. So I think, the answer to your question is yes, there's a ton of this, but it has challenges which are kind of present for victim communities around the world in their engagement with Global North institutions.
And I think just to add, current sort of the core group of countries that moves the resolution of Sri Lanka, in 2012 it started as a US resolution, but now, back then in the Trump years when the US left the council, the UK had to step up to the mantle. They were the main holders of the resolution, but also the UK has a strained past with Sri Lanka. They have colonized Sri Lanka back then. So those attitudes are still there to Western governments and things like that. And so currently the composition of the core group is Canada, Malawi, Montenegro, North Macedonia, the UK and the US. We had Germany at one point, but I think they've left, and I think the only global south country is Malawi. So the optics wise, because that does matter, right? And back in Sri Lanka, with the sort of new proposals that are coming up, there's been a sort of 3 countries that have been helping the Sri Lankan government with that process as well. There's been the Japanese, the Swiss, and the South Africans who've been supportive to a great degree on this new proposal of a TRC. And that's hugely problematic because the victims have issued statement after statement after statement saying this is not the time for truth commissions, we've been through this process before, please give us something that has accountability linked to it that's going to get us actual answers. That doesn't really get the field. So it's a tough calculation on how to use the international community, but also make sure they play the role that the victims want them to play as well.
Thank you so much for your talk today. I was thinking about, as you mentioned, the recent elections with the AKD and those their previous statements seem to suggest a little bit more amenability towards truth and reconciliation and such movements, but kind of walking some of those statements back now that they're in power. And I guess that's part of that is just that with a population, a majority population that tends to not particularly recognize the need for such things or not feel any particular priority for such, it's difficult to me to understand what levers can be pushed from an international perspective, both statewide and non-state actors, to kind of impact that. I mean, it feels in a lot of ways like the international legal framework focus on sovereignty and such tends to limit a lot of actions when it comes to this. And there's very little, I think, discussion that I've seen about international actors trying to change the prevailing opinions and moods within a country. And I'm wondering what your perspective is of that sort of avenue and how, when you get politicians that have to change their or have to moderate their opinions for the majority population, how that can be dealt with in a way that really at least pushes us towards justice.
Yeah, I think this is one of the great frustrations probably for domestic activists trying to get support from international actors is that it is, I probably should let you speak to this point actually.
I can chime in.
But it is so apparent that the major political barrier to transitional justice is domestic political attitudes, right? But no international intervention throws money and influence at that problem, right? So, I frequently have heard from it, and this is not just talking about the Sri Lankan case, but I frequently heard from, minority community activists on the ground in post-atrocity contexts where, all they want from the US government is for them to, fund a massive public education campaign aimed at the majority community to educate them about what happened. And that's just simply something that structurally doesn't get funded. Does that resonate with your experience?
Absolutely, and this is something the victims say as well, right? A lot of say NGO funding or civil society funding that comes from the donor community sometimes is targeted towards the victim community. And they're like, we know about transitional justice already. Please go use your money to educate the South, the Sinhalese majority. We know about this already. So I think, and with regards to the NPP, I would just add that, I know as any government would, they've been campaigning a lot over the last few weeks, asking for not just a majority, they want super majority in parliament right now. Which personally speaking, I don't think any government should have, because it's always been a recipe for disaster in Sri Lanka. And there should be a situation, and there are enough parties, TNA, there's the SJP, who could come in, and they have said that they are willing to support the government on the good things that kind of align with their policies. So I hope that going forward, I hope the NPP doesn't get a super majority, that a simple majority is more than enough for simple law reform. If they want constitutional change, which requires a super majority, I hope they can do consensus building within, with the TNA, for example, with the SJP, with other political parties that are on the same page, and that's actually how you move forward, right? On the TNA's call, on the devolution question, the national question, I think there should be an opportunity for other political parties in the opposition to come in and have a dialogue and move that needle forward.
There's a question from the online audience. Can Sri Lanka learn anything from the truth commissions established in other countries to set up its own credible TRC, which addresses accountability and non-recurrence? Which country or countries have established TRCs that meet international standards?
Let me piggyback on that question and ask another potential comparative question. So, also in connection with what earlier was asked about domestic levers, I'm wondering, when you're talking about public sentiments, it's one of unawareness. I'm wondering how much of it is an awareness and how much of this is an active support for the violence, which may present as unawareness now, but it's also something that needs a truth process to kind of figure out. So the question is public sentiment. Based on public sentiment, are there Sinhalese or Tamil articulations for the need for justice that aren't articulated in terms of the language of transitional justice? So that's more of a deeper question. The other question I have is more of a tactical question. I remember when transitional justice was happening in Egypt and Tunisia, there was a large public demand for transitional justice for economic crimes, for corruption. And I wonder if there's something similar in Sri Lanka, and if there is, if that could be the strategic or tactical window of opportunity, because that would have a public support that you could piggyback on. I'm just wondering, about these things because they are different.
Yeah, I can start with that. So on the corruption angle, I think, there has been a lot of public demand, especially from the Sinhalese South, I would say, for obviously, accountability. And I think this is really sort of where the bridge is between, because impunity is entrenched across the board. Be it corruption, be it human rights violations, there just isn't a good system of a check, right? So I think, and one aspect of this is also the fact that we have a deeply problematic Attorney General's department, which has this dual role. So in other countries, we see independent prosecuting officers that are able to carry out prosecutions. But in Sri Lanka, that role is also played by the Attorney General's department, who is also the lead legal advisor to the state. So here, and appears on behalf of the state. So you can't expect one one unit to play two contradicting roles, which is to appear for the state but also prosecute crimes against the state. So it just doesn't work. And there have been recommendations now with the economic angle coming up from Transparency International through the IMF processes that we need an independent prosecutor's office at least for the economic crimes. But that is that has been a long-standing call from the human rights community to try and have, an independent prosecutor that has the mandate to look at everything. So I think that's an inroad, and just in terms of the TRCs, I would just say, Sri Lanka has romanticized South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission model for so long. There have been study trips taken by consecutive governments to South Africa. Everybody comes back all starry-eyed, thinks this could be a system that works, but Sri Lanka's system and people's attitudes, religion, it's very different to that of South Africa. And we have had discussions with the South African High Commission in Colombo around this as well, what worked for you doesn't really necessarily work for us. And in fact, victims, even if they were on board with truth commissions or an idea for a truth commission back then, it's not something they are willing to entertain now because the environment couldn't have been any worse, right? There's ongoing human rights violations targeting the Tamil minority as well as the Muslim minority. There's land acquisitions that's still going on. There's land that's still not been released back to the public that's been occupied by the military. There's the PTA, the terror law, is still in operation. It's not. There's not even a moratorium on it. And so there could not, and the whole host of commissions in the past, which pretty much this TRC would be reinventing the wheel on, because we've done this multiple times before. And what does this new TRC solution offer that we didn't have that in the past? The only difference is that back in the past, these truth-seeking bodies were appointed through a presidential commission inquiry. This time, the TRC, the bill envisages to be passed through parliament, so it's a legislative body. So that's kind of like the only difference, so they're accountable to parliament a little bit. But quite apart from that, there's nothing that's different from the previous processes. There's no, this envisages also a body that would implement recommendations, but there are so many recommendations from previous commissions already out there. So the victims are like, let's start with those. Let's see you at least start implementing some of them. Those are the trust building mechanisms, trust building attitudes that would be conducive for something like this.
Yeah, and I would add to this, it's very telling that when Sri Lankan officials cite the South African precedent, they almost always talk about the Truth Commission as a place for victims to come and tell their stories. And amnesties. What victims want, and what the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission did, was to be a place for perpetrators to tell their stories, right? So it is not going to provide anything new to victims. It is not going to provide anything satisfying to victims unless it comes with actual teeth which compel the revelation of information that only perpetrators have. And there has been no sense from any of the number of successive Sri Lankan regimes citing the South African example that is something they are interested in doing, willing to do, or even contemplating doing.
And I think the key thing that I think even people who mooted the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission during the 2015 Transitional Justice package was that it goes hand in hand with a judicial mechanism. And that would be the only difference to a presidential commission of inquiry from the past. But that really is absent in the draft bill at the moment, because what it does is, even though it doesn't provide amnesties, what it says is that if in the course of the TRC process that it becomes evident that there's been some crime that's committed, it reroutes the victims back to the existing domestic justice process, as if victims haven't time and time again over the past decade and a half engaged with every single one of them. So it's a joke.
And on that note, do we have time for one more question, or are we?
We're done.
Okay. Thank you all for your very good questions. Thank you, audience at home.
Thank you so much for joining us, and if there's any questions, we'll take it up. Thank you.